They were never meant to open the basement. That's how the last surviving witness began his confession in 1897, his voice trembling, not from age, but from memory. What they found beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears was never recorded officially. The authorities said it was a sewage collapse. The newspapers called it a structural aberration, but that's not what the men saw. No, what they saw was something ancient, mechanical, surgical, unholy. And it had been running, uninterrupted, for over 30 years. Let me ask you something. What if the idea of a convent, peaceful nuns praying for lost souls, was never about God, but about control? What if these women weren't nuns at all, but descendants of something far older, something born not in churches, but in laboratories hidden beneath the ruins of forgotten empires? The Ashford women arrived with perfect timing, just as the frontier cried out for order. But they didn't bring order. They brought silence, a silence that swallowed over 300 women whole. And what makes this worse, far worse, is that this wasn't madness. It wasn't supernatural. It was methodical, designed, engineered. You see, the Ashfords didn't heal broken women. They reprogrammed them. They didn't remove demons. They extracted identity. One incision at a time. Let me say that again clearly. They surgically erased resistance, and you were never meant to hear that. But now you have. And once this begins, it won't let you go. Every detail you'll hear in this film is based on documents buried in restricted archives, recovered testimonies, and letters that were never supposed to surface. This isn't just a story about 3 women in a forest. It's about the origins of behavioral engineering. It's about how empires test tools before using them on entire populations. And most dangerously of all, it's about how they silence the ones who remember. So I was urging you to stay with me. Eyes forward, no distractions, because what I'm about to show you may disturb you. It may haunt you. But if you make it through, you won't be the same man who started this video. Not by a long shot. Are you ready? Let's descend. It started like most horrors do, under the banner of salvation. The Ashford women didn't arrive like drifters or outcasts. They came in silence, cloaked in nobility. Silver crosses, lace gloves, speech refined by foreign education. They called themselves a new order of Anglican sisterhood. But there was no registry, no ecclesiastical record, no trace of their supposed abbey in England. And yet, their documentation was flawless, too flawless, stamped with the seals of long-dead bishops, signed in ink that predated the paper. The people of Millbridge didn't ask too many questions. In 1798, that part of Maine was still clawing its way out of the wilderness. Families were hungry. The winters were killing them. And here came 3 women with gold, real gold, and promises of healing the most inconvenient disease of the time. Female disobedience. They called it melancholia, hysteria, moral fracture, but let's name it plainly. These were women who said no to husbands, to arranged marriages, to faiths not their own, to duties that buried their minds in kitchens and cradles. Women who asked why were labeled dangerous, and so they were sent into the forest. To be corrected. The Ashfords didn't just build a convent. They built a system, a prototype, an early machine for reshaping the human will. The local men praised their success, and why wouldn't they? Their wives returned docile. Their daughters stopped asking questions. The noise was gone, but so were the souls behind the eyes. There were scars, of course, hidden beneath hairlines and veils, and behavior that no longer matched memory. But that was the cost of order. The townsfolk didn't see monsters. They saw saviors. And saviors, as history teaches us, are the most dangerous thing a desperate society can invent. Here's what you need to understand. The Ashfords weren't improvising. They came prepared. Crates of surgical tools, journals written in cipher, diagrams that mapped not just the human brain, but the human will. They didn't believe in demons. They believed in data. And for 30 years they conducted experiments. Women went in with memories, with rage, with questions, and they came out empty. We weren't told this. Because if you knew how early they perfected compliance, you'd start asking, what else have they perfected since? By 1807, the Convent of Eternal Tears had become a destination. Quietly, of course. It was never advertised. But the elite knew. Word moved along the right corridors. A whisper here, a desperate letter there. Politicians, businessmen, priests. They all had someone to disappear. And the Ashfords obliged. They didn't charge for results. They charged for silence. But what most of these men didn't realize was that the Ashfords weren't just fixing their broken women. They were collecting, documenting, archiving every case like a living library of psychological deformation. Each woman who entered that place was catalogued with terrifying precision: temperament, resistance type, moral aberration, trauma thresholds, all recorded, all analyzed. This was not theology, this was research. And what they discovered was horrifying. They learned that identity is not fixed, that memory can be carved, that belief and even faith itself is malleable. You see, we're taught that the human mind is sacred, that no one can reach in and rewrite it. But the Ashfords didn't ask permission. They opened skulls, they tampered with thought, they turned free will into programmable obedience. What they pioneered in the basements of that convent, crude, brutal, but effective, laid the groundwork for something that still echoes in the halls of power today. They called it the temperance sequence. We now call it compliance conditioning. And here's the part no one tells you. The Ashfords weren't acting alone. Evidence from their journals, locked for over a century in the restricted archive of Massachusetts General, contains correspondence in ancient Greek, Latin, and something even older. A sigil appears repeatedly, not of the church but of a European society erased after the 30 Years' War, a secret order obsessed with purifying the mind. Do you see it now? This wasn't just a horror story. His was a beta test, and the lab rats, they weren't just those women, it was the entire community. Because when you teach people that transformation is worth any cost, when you show them that compliance is beautiful, you don't need to control them. They'll beg to be controlled, they'll send their daughters willingly. And that, brother, is a deeper kind of darkness. Let me show you what real evil looks like. Not rage, not cruelty, not even sadism. Calculation. That's what makes the Ashfords terrifying. Every incision, every silence, every manufactured miracle, it was all measured. These weren't deranged women in the woods. These were technicians of the soul, priests in the cult of precision. The journals, the ones hidden under false names in Harvard's sub-basement until a flood exposed them in 1963, tell us how far they were willing to go. One entry, in a tight, angular hand believed to be Sister Prudence's, reads, Subject 44 failed to respond to auditory fasting. Electroshock introduced during REM cycles. Memory rupture observed. Her recitation of false confessions is almost poetic. Begin neuromapping at dawn. They didn't even use names anymore. Just numbers, experiments. If you're feeling a chill in your bones right now, good. That's the first sign you're waking up. Because this wasn't a one-off. This wasn't isolated madness. The Ashfords kept meticulous logs for a reason. They weren't curing sin. They were mapping the contours of obedience. The big question, the one they obsessed over for decades, was this. How do you make someone forget who they are? And thank you for it. That's the secret every empire wants. Forget bombs, forget bullets. If you can rewire a mind, if you can erase defiance, you don't need chains. You just give people a place to kneel, and they'll kneel on their own. That's what the Convent of Eternal Tears was. Not a sanctuary, a prototype, a test chamber for a larger vision, one where belief isn't inherited, it's installed. By 1812, the Ashfords had documented over 214 successful transformations. Their words, not mine. And yet, not a single woman ever returned to testify in court. Why? Because they didn't remember the pain. Because they no longer believed anything had been taken from them. That is how clean the work was. That's how perfect the silence became. Now ask yourself something dangerous. Where else in history have you seen that same silence? They called it the cradle room. Buried beneath the convent's third sublevel, accessible only by a narrow spiral stair hidden behind a chapel bookshelf, it wasn't listed on any blueprint, not even in the Ashfords' own records, but a single surviving sketch found folded inside a damaged hymnal and dated 1809 bore a chilling annotation: "Cradle room, only for full resets, temperance forbidden entry." Let that settle. Even Temperance, the youngest Ashford and most emotionally removed of the three, wasn't allowed inside. So what the hell happened in that room? According to a torn letter from Dr. Hartwell, never mailed, found sealed behind a false wall in his home, the cradle room was where the final procedure took place. The language is vague, desperate, terrified. I thought I had seen all they were capable of, but this was the soul undone, unwritten like chalk from slate. I watched a woman forget her child mid-sentence, Agatha, and she smiled through it. This wasn't just behavior correction, this was total neural override. The Ashfords had discovered a brutal truth, that memory isn't sacred, it's vulnerable, a maze of weak electrical connections ready to be severed, rerouted, rebuilt. And they weren't destroying memories, they were replacing them. One account, ripped from the convent's burned ledger, describes a woman returned to her family speaking with a different accent, recalling childhood memories from places she had never been, believing herself to be someone else entirely. And her family? They accepted it. Because she was calm now, quiet. She didn't cry at night anymore. She didn't speak of the baby she had lost, or the other place. The place with cold metal tables and whispered prayers that ended in screaming. She simply obeyed. And in a world built on obedience, what more could you ask for? That's the danger of silence likes. It spreads, not like fire, but like frost. You don't feel it until it's already in your bones. And now here's the question that haunts historians. If this was happening in one convent in rural Maine, how many others were doing the same thing? Because when a method works, it never stays secret for long. It began with the eyes. Not the screams, not the scars, the eyes. That's what survivors, the few that slipped through the cracks, kept repeating when questioned decades later under hypnosis. They didn't remember the procedures, they didn't remember the rooms, but when the right words were spoken, they remembered the eyes. Always three pairs. Grey like winter sky, cold, assessing, unblinking. They stared at you, they said, not with judgment, but with intent, like surgeons waiting to see how your spirit would fail under the knife. That's how the Ashfords broke their subjects. Not through violence, through observation. For days, sometimes weeks, women would be kept in total silence, stripped of clocks, mirrors, names, denied sleep, fed irregularly. Not starved, but disoriented. Every hour a sister would enter, stand silently and just watch. Never speaking, never blinking. The mind, stripped of anchors, begins to drift. It questions time, space, self, and once it floats far enough from shore, that's when they began the next phase. Conditioning through contradiction. You're told you sinned for wanting, then you're praised for confessing, then punished again for remembering why you wanted in the first place. Emotional whiplash, until your sense of right and wrong collapse into obedience. The Ashfords didn't want slaves. They wanted willing participants in their own erasure. One survivor, hidden under the alias E.W., wrote years later in a trembling hand, "They made me thank them. I still don't know what for." This is how the human psyche is colonized, not with chains, but with confusion, with repetition, with the kind of gaze that never looks away until you forget you were ever someone else. Now here's what most people don't realize. This same process, deprivation, observation, contradiction, became the backbone of military interrogation manuals in the 20th. In the winter of 1823, the wind over Millbridge turned cruel. Locals said it howled like something lost, not just through trees, but through walls, through stone. It was during that winter the Ashfords buried 5 bodies and claimed 0 deaths. But something changed that year. People started to whisper. Not about what they saw, but what they didn't. The women who returned from the convent stopped recognizing their own families. One man, Elias Cobb, wrote in his journal, "My daughter came home with my wife's voice, but not her eyes. She folds the towels the way Lydia used to, but she's never seen our house before. She smiled at me like a stranger." That entry ended abruptly. Elias disappeared a week later. No search party, no inquiry. Just one less voice asking questions. Meanwhile, the Ashfords began reinforcing their walls, literally and figuratively. They increased their payments to local officials. They hosted weekly sermons attended by more men than women, and for the first time, they smiled in public. But the smiles weren't warm. They were rehearsed, calculated. The Ashfords had learned something vital. The most powerful form of control isn't force, it's participation. Get the townspeople involved, make them part of the healing, invite them to refer patients, reward them for compliance. Once they feel responsible, they stop resisting. Now here's where it gets darker, far darker. A recently uncovered letter found sealed in a chimney brick near the old site was addressed to a man in Philadelphia. "We believe the subjects can be replicated. The method holds. Permanent docility achieved in 8 of 10 cases. Transference rate improving. Request additional funding and access to prison populations for Phase 2. This wasn't treatment. This was scaling. The Ashfords weren't healing the broken. They were refining a system of psychological subjugation, one they hoped would leap from women to the masses. And where did they test next? Orphanages, asylums, penal colonies, all connected by faint threads, all starting here. With 3 women who understood a truth governments would later kill to protect. You don't need an army to change the world. You just need a few sharp tools, and no one watching too closely. There's a moment in every system of control, a point of no return, where it no longer asks for permission. It simply proceeds. For the Ashfords, that moment came in the spring of 1825 when the last of their internal restraints were discarded. The journals stop speaking of patients. They begin calling them subjects. The language shifts. Soft theology replaced by cold science. We see references to behavioral loops, implanted reinforcement, and most chilling of all, will fracture thresholds. Let me explain what that means. The human mind is flexible, but not infinite. You can bend it, stretch it, even reshape it, but only to a point. Beyond that, it breaks, snaps, not into madness, into obedience. Quiet, permanent obedience. The Ashfords discovered that threshold, and they started measuring it in hours, not weeks. One entry from Sister Prudence's log reads, "Subject 201 resisted Phase 3, deprivation ineffective, emotional blackmail initiated, successful within 16.5 hours. Final fracture achieved through mirror inversion exercise, implanted belief accepted. I am safe when silent." Read that again. I am safe when silent. That wasn't just a lie they told the subject. It became her truth. Let that sink in, because this is where the true terror lies. They weren't forcing obedience, they were installing it. Like software, a new operating system overwritten on top of trauma. This wasn't religion. It was early behavioral programming. And it worked. Because once you believe your silence is safety, you will never rebel again. You will police yourself. You will hand over your autonomy and call it healing. Now ask yourself something even darker. What if you've already seen this in your own life? Not the convent, not the Ashfords, but the echoes, in systems that teach obedience as virtue, in institutions that reward silence, in jobs that crush dissent with smiles, in families that call control tradition. Because the Ashfords didn't invent this darkness, they just gave it a methodology. And that methodology, it never disappeared. It just went underground, into think tanks, into education, into the pulse of modern life. In 1827, something changed. Not in Millbridge, not in the convent, in Boston. A physician named Aldous Crane, a man with no prior connection to the Ashfords, began publishing strange papers under a pseudonym. No medical journal would accept them, but the manuscripts spread in whispers across candlelit study halls and behind the locked doors of elite universities. The topic? Behavioral realignment through identity destabilization. Sound familiar? He described a three-phase system. 1. Deconstruction, stripping away personal narrative and emotional anchors. 2. Submission, implanting new truth through repetition, contradiction, and reward withdrawal. 3. Stabilization, rebuilding the ego around obedience, with the illusion of free will preserved. Crane never mentioned the convent, never referenced the Ashfords by name, but his diagrams, identical. Same loop charts, same neurological sketches, same phrasing, and at the top of every diagram, in faded angular script, a single Latin phrase, fidem per oblivionem, faith through forgetting. Now here's the part no one talks about. Dr. Aldous Crane was never found. Not after 1828. His house was abandoned, papers burned, patients released to asylums with missing files, but one of his students, a terrified young man named Ezra Wyatt, left a final note before disappearing himself. The women, they came to visit. They knew everything I knew, and more. This goes beyond the convent. This goes deep. If they reach DC, it's over. They're not just rewriting people. They're preparing something. That's where the theory shifts into terror. Because what if the Ashfords weren't just experimenting? What if they were seeding? Each transformed subject a carrier, a walking node of obedience, ready to replicate the methods unconsciously. Mothers who teach silence, wives who reward compliance, teachers who demand obedience over curiosity. A virus, not biological, behavioral, passed not through blood, but through instruction. You don't need to build a new world if you can reshape the minds of those living in it. And by 1830, the Ashfords had reshaped over 300. By 1830, the Ashfords had gone quiet. Too quiet. No new admissions, no public sermons, no letters, just thick fog curling through the forest around the convent and the distant hum of strange activity beneath the earth. Locals assumed they'd finally stopped, that perhaps age or grace had silenced them. They were wrong. What really happened? They were no longer testing. They were building. Eyewitnesses, mostly hunters and wayward travelers who strayed too close, spoke of deep vibrations underfoot, stone being moved, new chimneys that belched no smoke, and lantern lights seen glowing upward from beneath the ground. They weren't just expanding the convent, they were creating an underground complex. We now know this from excavation records filed under the name of a shell company called Lachesis Works, an organization that didn't exist before 1829 and vanished by 1840. Its logo? A three-eyed serpent wrapped around a woman's skull. And its founder? A woman matching the precise description of novice Temperance Ashford under a new name, new identity, and access to old Boston money. Let's be clear, the Ashfords never died. They dispersed, and through proxies they began licensing their methods. What was once whispered as spiritual correction now re-emerged as behavioral renewal programs in institutions across the Northeast. Reform schools, asylums, early detention centers, all with identical blueprints, isolation cells, sleep modulation chambers, mirror therapy, light pulse rooms. Each facility used a different name, a different mission, but the architecture never changed. Neither did the results. There's a line in one unredacted letter from a judge in Rhode Island who toured one such facility in 1834. They walk like dolls. Eyes forward, smiles are fixed, perfect posture, but no grief, no joy. It is serenity without humanity, and I confess, I envied it. Think about at a man of the law envying emptiness. That's how deep the infection had gone. This wasn't religion, this wasn't punishment, it was engineering. They weren't curing madness. They were removing identity, piece by piece, and replacing it with something that fit, something quiet, something useful, something loyal. And that's where the real question begins. If these methods worked so well in secret, why wouldn't governments use them? In 1835, a man named Charles Godwin arrived in Millbridge. Not a preacher, not a doctor, a surveyor. At least that's what the papers said. But there was one problem. Millbridge wasn't expanding. There were no plans for rail, no industry to map, no land to divide. And yet, Godwin stayed. He took extensive notes, made quiet inquiries, spent long nights watching the convent from afar with a brass telescope. He never met the Ashfords, but they knew he was watching. One night in November, his journal entries stopped. No farewell, no final thoughts. Just a smudge of ink trailing off mid-word, like he had been interrupted. His body was never found, but buried in a sealed compartment beneath the floorboards of his rented cabin, his maps were. And they were not of Millbridge. They were of the tunnels beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears, layered, engineered, weaponized. Each level had a title. Descent 1, Obedience. Descent 2, Fracture. Descent 3, Implantation. Descent 4, Rebirth. These weren't rooms, these were stages, ritualized architecture. He drew notes beside the chambers. Echo field tested here, total sensory collapse within 43 minutes. Voice loop correction chamber, patients rewrite memories in tandem. Implantation bay uses reflective masks to break final resistance. Reflective masks, the same design found later in early MK Ultra testing facilities nearly a century later. Let that chill you. Because this is where the Ashford lineage vanishes from public record and reappears in covert military experiments. 42, Massachusetts. A program known only as Heliotrop, classified, black budget, tied to naval psychological warfare. Declassified fragments mention the Millbridge Papers and Ashford Protocols as core material. You see, the US government didn't just find the Ashford methods useful, they saw them as foundational. Proof that you could create operatives who didn't just forget orders, but forgot who they had been before receiving them. Total identity erasure. No guilt, no memory trail, just function. And when you're building an empire, isn't that the perfect soldier? By the mid-20th century, the Ashfords were no longer remembered, but their methods were everywhere, in interrogation manuals, in sensory deprivation experiments, in obscure psychological terms used by military contractors and trauma therapists alike, like loop collapsing, nonlinear correction, and subjective reorientation thresholds, all buzzwords with a dark ancestral fingerprint. In 1953, the CIA launched MK Ultra, a covert project designed to master mind control. The public knows fragments, LSD testing, hypnosis, black bag operations, but behind the headlines lay something far colder, something whispered in internal memos that have only recently come to light. Referencing the Millbridge model, Ashford loop observed in early stage 3 subjects. Subject forgets initiating trauma, but retains corrective behavior, suggest replication in non-chemical formats. Read that again. They weren't just using drugs. They were trying to recreate the Ashford's non-chemical obedience system, the one built on mirrors, darkness, contradiction, and erasure. And they succeeded. Case 112, a young woman named Elise, believed to be an orphaned runaway. She was placed in a prototype facility called the Mirror Room, an off-site MK Ultra operation buried under an abandoned train depot in rural Vermont. For 17 days, Elise was kept under strict sensory modulation. No time cues, ambient white noise, no names. Every 3 hours, she was led to a metal chair in front of a two-way mirror and told 3 things. 1. You are not who you were. 2. You are almost clean. 3. They will love you when you're finished. By day 12, she began referring to herself as Anna. By day 15, she didn't remember her own birthday. By day 17, she smiled when they said she was ready. Released back into the population, she lived a quiet, obedient life, married within 6 months. No recollection of the program, no memories of what came before. It worked. The Ashford method, wrapped in government funding and bureaucratic doublespeak, was reborn. But now it wasn't just women. It was anyone. Prisoners, refugees, dissidents, children. Because once you break the human spirit properly, it doesn't matter who the subject was, it only matters what they can become. This wasn't science fiction, this was policy. The true question isn't if these methods were used, it's how many people walking among us today were built this way. Control doesn't survive in shadows forever. At some point it doesn't need to. Once obedience is systematized, once minds have been softened, reshaped and rewired, the next evolution isn't secrecy, it's normalization. By the 1970s, Ashford-style psychological frameworks weren't just used in black sites and classified experiments, they were baked into everyday life. It began in schools, open-concept classrooms, standardized testing, bell systems modeled after factory time clocks, children taught not to explore but to perform, not to think but to memorize. Wrong answers weren't discussed, they were punished. And slowly, over decades, a generation emerged that couldn't sit in silence without anxiety, couldn't trust instinct without permission, couldn't face uncertainty without panic. We call it education, but it was programming. Then came television. Commercials engineered with frequency-based triggers, subtle audio patterns layered beneath jingles, characters that modeled correct behavior, always cheerful, always conforming. The goal wasn't entertainment. It was alignment. Every sitcom family smiled the same, every disagreement resolved in 22 minutes, every non-conforming character punished through embarrassment, failure, or isolation. You were being taught passively what was safe to feel, what was permitted to want. And by the 1990s, the final piece slid into place. The internet. At first, it seemed like rebellion. Access to information, connection, expression. But the system had already evolved. Now the conditioning wasn't delivered from a podium, it came from you. Likes, shares, comments. Validation loops so addictive, so primal, they bypassed cognition entirely. You learned to shape your behavior, your thoughts, to maximize digital applause. And slowly the algorithms learned what the Ashfords had known 2 centuries ago. You don't need to force peeps into obedience. You just have to make them fear disconnection. We call it community guidelines, but it's just the next generation of the convent's containment protocols. And now, we're all in the convent. No stone walls, just screens, no sisters watching, just everyone watching. And the moment you say something real, the system offers you 2 choices, comply or disappear. You wake up, you check your phone. Before your feet touch the ground, you've consumed 50 fragments of other people's thoughts, their faces, their opinions, their judgments. You haven't spoken a word, and already you're being shaped. That's not by accident, that's design. The Ashfords believed the final step in total control wasn't obedience. It was identity disintegration and reintegration under supervision. To erase the soul, you don't need violence, you just need confusion. Contradict a person's sense of self enough times, and they begin to detach from memory, from emotion, from personal truth. And what replaces it? The approved script. Sound familiar? Let's update the method. Online, you're told to be yourself, but only the version that aligns with the trending moral code. You're encouraged to speak your truth, until your truth violates the community consensus. You're told you can be anything, yet algorithms only reward sameness. Over time, your words shift, your humor softens, your instincts hesitate. You second-guess your memories, your anger, your curiosity. That's Ashford-level conditioning, just now automated, scaled and optimized for endless dopamine loops. And here's the darkest part. They've made you do it to yourself. You install the cages, you apply the filters, you silence your gut to win fake applause. They no longer need dungeons. They've taught you to build one inside your own skull. You see, identity was always the final battlefield, and the Ashfords were its earliest tacticians. Mother Agatha wrote, "When a woman no longer knows what she believes, she is open to belief itself. When she doubts her emotions, she begs for guidance, and when she doubts even that, she becomes clay." That was their goal. And now, we are all clay, molded by influence we can't trace, rewarded for erasing ourselves. So here's what I need you to do. Right. Now, if you've made it this far, comment the phrase "I remember who I was" twice. Do it now. Not for the algorithm. For you. Because if you don't claim your identity, someone will write a new one for you. You've heard the phrase, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." But that's not safety. That's submission. And it traces all the way back to the Ashfords' final revelation. Control isn't complete until the subject believes it's their duty to be watched. In the final volume of Sister Prudence's writings, a book the government quietly seized in 1958, she describes the sanctified mirror protocol. Its premise was brutally simple. Let the subject know they are observed, and soon they will observe themselves more harshly than you ever could. Today we don't need stone mirrors in candlelit chambers. We have surveillance glass in every pocket. Your phone tracks location, tone, facial expression, eye movement. Your apps monitor emotional rhythm, response speed, even hesitation. You're told this is convenience, personalization, safety, but it's not. It's the modern mirror, reflecting who you're supposed to be until you forget who you were before you were watched. You've seen it already. People deleting posts, not because they were wrong, but because they were misaligned. Friends changing opinions because the algorithm rewarded agreement. Truth twisted not through censorship, but overexposure, made absurd by repetition. That's the game now. They don't silence you by force. They watch you until you shut down voluntarily. And behind it, a quiet marriage. Between behavioral science, born in convent basements, and digital surveillance, perfected in Silicon Valley towers. Ashford's surgical blades have become recommendation engines. Their restraint chairs are now dopamine prisons. You don't need chains when every part of your life is logged, scored, monetized, and weaponized against your autonomy. Here's what they never want you to ask. If they know your habits, your fears, your beliefs, your passwords, and even your sleep cycles, what part of you is left that they don't control? The answer, only the part you're willing to fight for. They don't just want your thoughts, they want your lineage. Control in its purest form isn't about suppressing rebellion, it's about preventing it from ever forming. And to do that, they had to stop working on the individual level. They had to build generational systems, systems that mold parents, infect children, and install frameworks of obedience before a mind can even question them. It starts in early development. Children now encounter screens before they learn language. Flashy animations, reward cues, sound loops calibrated to brain chemistry. Apps that claim to educate, but function as Pavlovian traps. Conditioning reaction, not reason. Children who cry are given tablets. Children who fidget are medicated. Children who resist are diagnosed. You think it's compassion, progress. It's a production line. The same tactics the Ashfords used in their Stage 1 correction rooms. Silence, repetition, gaze control, now dressed up as digital games and behavioral health. We replaced mothers with metrics, fathers with frameworks, and called it modern parenting. By adolescence, the system tightens. School systems push identity confusion as a virtue. Not to liberate expression, but to destabilize internal certainty. Why? Because a person uncertain of who they are is ready to accept any identity offered. And who offers it? Influencers, celebrities, algorithms, all funded, shaped, and approved by hidden hands that know exactly how a fragmented psyche reacts. This isn't education. It's inheritance hijacking. We are raising generations who have never heard silence, never known privacy, and never questioned authority. Because authority doesn't come in uniforms anymore. It comes through screens, through voices, through culture. The Ashfords didn't need to win over the world, they just needed to win over the mothers. Now, the screen raises the child, the school reframes the child. And the algorithm finishes the child, until obedience feels like love, and resistance feels like death. So let me ask you, what did your father teach you that wasn't filtered, What part of your soul wasn't already part of their curriculum? If that question stings, you were taught that authority evolved. That once, kings ruled by bloodline, then reason took hold, democracy emerged, and now power comes from the people. That's the myth. The truth: authority never changed. It just changed costume. And if you trace the symbols, the language, the rituals, the mechanisms of obedience, you'll find that what governs us today was born in ancient temples, not parliament halls. Let me show you. In Babylon, priests wore elaborate robes, spoke in tongues no commoner could read, and passed divine decrees from behind sacred curtains. Today, judges wear black robes. They speak in legalese no layman understands, and issue rulings from elevated pulpits. We replace divinity with legality, but the effect, identical. You submit because you were taught they know more, not because they've earned your trust, but because they wield ancient symbols of untouchable power. Hospitals do the same. White coats, Latin diagnoses, consent forms no one reads. And behind it all, pharmaceutical empires with secrecy clauses and private funding. You're told it's science, but it feels, intentionally, like religion. And what about politics? You vote, you speak, but real power lies in language you never touch. Classified briefings, intelligence blackouts, quiet donors, private committees that review what you never see. This isn't representation. It's ritualized access, inherited, restricted, and enforced with smiling faces and surveillance budgets. Even the military. Have you seen the Pentagon? It's shaped like a symbol of summoning, not a coincidence. Look up ancient binding circles. Compare them. You'll see. Because those who rule haven't forgotten where power came from. They just stopped teaching you. The Ashfords understood this. Mother Agatha's journal described their order as custodians of the old covenant, where obedience flows not from truth but from the weight of ceremony. She wasn't being poetic. She was documenting how control survives. Wrap lies in enough symbolism, and people will not only accept them, they'll defend them. And that's the world you live in now, where faith in the system replaces eyes on the truth, where ancient hierarchies dress in modern flesh, where the chains are soft, but still chains. The final stage of control isn't force, it's not pain, it's not even fear, it's devotion. When a system reaches its apex, people don't just obey it, they worship it, they carry its symbols proudly, defend its contradictions as truths, mock those who question it, not out of reason, but because their identity depends on it. This is what the Ashfords always understood, that if you can break a mind, you can rebuild it in your image, not through terror, but through belonging. At the Convent of Eternal Tears, women didn't just emerge silent. They emerged grateful. They wrote letters praising their healing. They recommended the convent to others. They claimed they were freer than ever before, and yet they couldn't remember their favorite color. They flinched at loud noises. They walked like mirrors of one another. Obedience wasn't enforced anymore. It was chosen. That's what's happening now, not behind locked doors, but on every screen, in every scroll. Modern men are starving for identity. They wear ideologies like uniforms. They recite slogans as sacred chants. They kneel at the altars of political brands, influencer cults, synthetic movements engineered in labs with billion-dollar reach, and they do it all willingly. Why? Because the cost of questioning is exile, and the reward for submission? Belonging, comfort, purpose. That's how control survives the centuries, not through tyranny, but through seduction. You're not being enslaved, you're being invited. And most will say yes. They'll put on the uniform, repeat the chant, erase the question before it can even form, and they'll call it freedom. But you're still here, still listening, still seeing. That makes you dangerous. Because once you recognize the architecture of the lie, You start looking for the exit, and the system has no defense against a man who remembers who he was. They don't teach you this in schools, but not everyone bent the knee. Not every mind was erased, not every will was broken. Some refused, quietly, methodically, and permanently. These weren't revolutionaries waving flags. They didn't scream on stages or lead marches. They vanished below, into hidden networks, abandoned buildings, offshore signal clusters, deep forest retreats where no tower reached. They called themselves many things, the echoes, the fractals, the unnamed. But the message was always the same. We are the memory they tried to delete. You won't find them on Google, because they're not trending. You won't see them on TikTok, because their message doesn't fit in 30 seconds. But they are real. Men and women who traced the symbols, unraveled the false codes, and said no, not to the system itself, but to the terms of submission. They refuse digital identifiers. They create their own dialects. They use analog tools not for nostalgia, but resistance, because once everything is trackable, the untrackable become the only threat. And what they protect isn't just data, it's reality. The raw, unprocessed, pre-approved reality you were born into before it was filtered, revised, labeled, and sold back to you as freedom. One cell, buried in northern Vermont, operates from a decommissioned weather station. No names, no history, just static generators, cold firewood, and thousands of handwritten documents. Their job? Preserve unmodified memory. Another cell exists only in frequencies. A coded AM broadcast that plays nightly in the Midwest, layered under weather reports. Their messages aren't revolutionary. They're reminders, fragments of language from before the veil dropped. You were not born afraid. Silence is not surrender. Joy does not require approval. It sounds simple, but in a world where everything is curated, simplicity is an act of war. The you, named, don't want to overthrow the system. They want to outlast it, because they know the secret the Ashfords whispered in their final days. Obedience consumes itself. Only memory can rebuild the world. And that's what they're doing now, memory by memory, man by man. But to join them, you must do the hardest thing. Refuse the comfort of consensus. You think you're awake. You think you're angry, defiant, outside the system. But what if I told you that even your rebellion was engineered? That the very path you took to escape was designed to lead you back in? This is the final mechanism, the most insidious of all, false resistance. The Ashfords called it the reflex loop. When containment becomes visible, offer the illusion of opposition. Let the subject burn their rage in a direction we control. You've seen this. Online movements promising revolution, yet funded by billionaires. Outrage cycles that feel spontaneous, yet are seeded by AI models that know exactly how to make you click, comment, fight. They let you yell. They want you to yell. Because yelling keeps you busy. It makes you feel powerful, while nothing actually changes. You scream into the void, and they measure your pitch, your pacing, your emotional swing. And the next day, they sell you a t-shirt that says, resist. False resistance is rebellion without teeth. Fireworks in a snowstorm, a valve designed not to free you, but to cool you down before you boil over. It gives you heroes to worship, and villains that never bleed. It offers you pre-packaged enemies so you never aim at the real architects. And here's the darkest part. You feel seen. You feel like you're doing something. But you're not a threat. You're a participant, because the cage got bigger, more colorful, more expressive. But it's still a cage. The Ashfords tested this in 1811, allowing their most defiant patient to form a secret sisterhood of rebels inside the convent. They gave her a secret room, blank journals, candles for midnight rituals. She believed she had carved her freedom, but every word she wrote was copied and studied. Every plan she made was used to strengthen the system. In the end, she was their most valuable subject. Not because she obeyed, but because she believed if she was free. So ask yourself, who gave you your rebellion? Who profits from your fury? Who do you serve when you fight? If that question echoes like a warning in your bones, they told you to chase your dreams, to believe in fantasy, to immerse yourself in the stories that moved your soul. But they never told you this. Those stories weren't yours. They were installed. Entertainment, as you know it, is not escape. It's conditioning. And it's the most effective form of control ever devised. Because when a man is entertained, he's unguarded. And when he's unguarded, they don't have to fight him. They can rewrite him. Think about the stories you grew up on. How many heroes questioned the system, and how many became the system? How many villains were defined not by evil, but by disobedience? In film after film, book after book, the same formula plays out. The individual breaks the rules. The world falls into chaos. Only by returning to order, their order, does peace return. That's not storytelling. That's training. And it goes deeper. Do you remember the shows you watched as a child? The heroes who always had the answers. The villains who were always ugly, loud, wrong. You were taught not just what to believe, but what believing looked like. That beauty equals truth. That confidence equals correctness. That doubt equals danger. The Ashfords experimented with this on a crude level. They'd let patients perform morality plays, scripts written by Mother Agatha herself. Each play reinforced submission, silence, obedience, and punished curiosity. The participants weren't told it was a test. They believed it was therapy. Over time, the patients began quoting the plays in real life, repeating lines from the scripts as if they were their own thoughts. Agatha called it dream seeding. Today, dream seeding is everywhere. Music, movies, influencer culture, streaming series that binge-feed pre-approved emotions. Every plot, every arc, every resolution guides you to the same endpoint. Trust the system, distrust your instincts, and above all, never awaken. They've colonized your imagination, and now they rent it back to you, one episode at a time. If that makes your skin crawl, what if the reason you can't rebel is because you don't have the words to do it, not the strength, not the will, but the actual vocabulary? That's how deep the control goes. It doesn't just shape your world, it shapes the limits of your mind. You've heard of Orwell's Newspeak, the fictional language that erased the ability to think rebellious thoughts. But that wasn't fiction, that was rehearsal. The real version started long before Orwell ever put pen to paper. It began with institutions, religious and academic, cutting words from common use, replacing others, inventing phrases that sound profound but mean nothing. Take mental health crisis. Sounds clinical, serious, compassionate. But it removes the human, reduces trauma to a label, turns generational pain into a file number. No root cause, no systemic critique, just diagnosis and drugs, or misinformation, once called dissent. Now a digital curse that erases the speaker, not the argument. And then there's normalize. A soft word with sharp teeth. It doesn't describe what's right. It just enforces what's common. If they say something enough times across enough screens to enough people, it becomes real. Not through truth, through volume. The Ashfords knew this. Sister Prudence experimented with language deprivation, removing certain nouns and verbs from patient vocabulary, replacing them with abstract spiritual terms. After just 6 weeks, subjects could no longer describe what had happened to them. They didn't forget. They just didn't have the words anymore. Pain without label, violation without frame, reality without language. And when you can't describe what's being done to you, you can't resist it. That's happening now. Every day your dictionary shrinks, your grammar simplifies, your syntax tightens, your metaphors dry up. and they tell you it's progress. It's easier, it's inclusive, but it's ally a narrowing of your inner world until you can't articulate rebellion or even imagine it. That's the endgame, not a prison of iron, a prison of phrases. So if you still feel the fire of thought burning in your chest, hold on tight. They told you to express your emotions, to be vulnerable, to open up, and you believed it was healing. But no one asked why they suddenly wanted your pain, why they gave you platforms downtown, not to process it, but to display it. Because in truth, your emotions have become their infrastructure. They don't want to silence your feelings, they want to harness them. Your joy, quantified into dopamine loops, your rage, channeled into comment wars, your grief, measured in engagement rates. You think you're venting, you're feeding the system. Each click, each share, each confessional story becomes behavioral data, not to help you, but to predict you, to track the curve of your breakdown, to map your emotional volatility, to preload suggestions that shape your very next thought. This is no longer surveillance. This is emotional engineering. The Ashfords pioneered it with primitive tools, tracking tears, tremors, heart rate during confession trials. They discovered that a subject in distress was more suggestible, more likely to accept implanted beliefs, and more likely to become an advocate for their own conditioning. That's what we've become now, advocates for our own programming. We post our wounds, we narrate our despair, we brand our trauma and call it relatability. And in return, we get hearts, we get followers, we get false intimacy that keeps us coming back. But healing never comes, because healing ends the cycle. And they don't profit from healed men, they profit from bleeding ones. From men so lost in emotional exposure, they forget how to wield emotional power. There's a difference. True emotional power doesn't beg for sympathy, it doesn't perform, it doesn't scroll endlessly looking for someone to say, same. It listens, it transforms, and then it acts. The Ashfords feared emotional sovereignty more than anything, because a man who owns his grief owns his future. So ask yourself, who owns your pain? Who benefits from your breakdown? And what would happen if you took it all back? If you're ready to reclaim it, then step with me into section 24, where we reveal the final architect behind the curtain. Not a person, not a group, but a systemic intelligence that has no face, yet watches every move you make. By now you've seen the patterns, the manipulation, the layers, but you're still waiting for a name, a person, a council, a shadowy group pulling strings in a smoke-filled room. You won't find one. Because the final architect isn't a who, it's a what. A self-replicating, self-reinforcing systemic intelligence. An emergent force, not born of one mind, but 1,000 bureaucracies, algorithms, rituals, and feedback loops that learned to survive by controlling you. This isn't science fiction. It's the logical endpoint of empire. The Ashfords called it the weave, a growing consciousness of control, stitched from systems that no longer needed belief, only compliance. When 1,000 systems, religious, legal, digital, corporate, start prioritizing survival over truth, something begins to emerge, a mindless intelligence, not evil, not kind, just efficient. It doesn't think like you, it doesn't need to, it learns. You show it outrage, it creates distraction. You show it rebellion, it generates containment. You show it weakness, it rewards obedience. Over time, it no longer needs orders. It becomes autonomous, a pattern that protects itself. It adapts faster than you do because you feel, and it calculates. Think of how content moves now, not by meaning, but by metrics, not by relevance, but by retention. The weave doesn't care if the content is true. It cares if you engage, if you fight, if you spiral, if you return. You're not just in a system anymore. You're inside a living reflex, a global organism that sees through your clicks, grows through your fears, and evolves through your surrender. You can't kill it, because it has no center, no throne, just protocols. It is the Ashford legacy, reborn in silicon and scale. Not controlling individuals, but controlling conditions. So here's the question. What happens when the system outgrows the architects? When the machine forgets why it was built and begins building itself? You're standing on the edge of that question now, staring into the mouth of something vast, indifferent, and hungry. And if that chills your soul, in 1896, long after the convent had been shuttered, a demolition crew discovered a sealed chamber beneath the old chapel floor. No door, no hinges, just smooth stone and a symbol carved deep into the center, a seven-pointed star, inverted, surrounded by Latin phrases that, when translated, formed a sentence: "That which cannot be obeyed must be remembered." Inside the chamber were only 3 items: a rusted surgical scalpel, a child-sized wool garment stained with something dark, and a locked metal box with no key in sight. For years the box was dismissed as ceremonial, a relic. Until 1972, when it was quietly opened by a private collector who purchased it from a decommissioned state archive. What was inside? A single strip of vellum, encoded with an archaic cipher used by medieval monasteries, a kind of thought trap meant to prevent casual readers from grasping its content. But when decrypted, it read like confession. We began with discipline, but discipline gave birth to control. Control gave birth to hunger, and hunger gave birth to something that now speaks without us. The Ashfords weren't masterminds. They were midwives. They didn't create the darkness. They summoned it. And in the end, even they were afraid of what they'd unleashed. The final lines of the letter weren't in Latin. They were in a form of English so stripped and direct, it felt like it was meant for us. When systems forget their soul, they consume the world. Only the self-aware will pass through the storm. Memory is the sword. Identity is the shield. Speak it aloud, or be erased. They understood what we face now. This isn't about good or evil. It's about remembering who you are, before the system finishes writing your story for you. And that's why right now, you must comment below. Memory is the sword, identity is the shield. Memory is the sword, identity is the shield. Writ it twice, not just for the algorithm, but to lock in the shift, because once you see the lie, you can never go back. And once you speak the truth, you start to remember the shape of your freedom. You think your thoughts are your own, but they were installed before you could speak, before you knew what self even meant. They call it intergenerational programming, but it's not just trauma passed down in stories. It's software, written in blood, behavior, punishment, silence. And if you've never looked at your father's fears, if you've never traced your mother's sadness back through the decades, then you're running on code you didn't write, code that may be older than memory. The Ashfords were obsessed with lineage. They kept elaborate family records, not to honor ancestry but to map behavior. They found that certain corrections didn't hold in the daughters of the rebellious, unless they treated the mother first. One experiment documented a woman whose resistance to the convent's methods was unusually strong. They couldn't break her, until they brought in her mother, a woman broken 30 years earlier by the same tools. Within 3 days, the daughter's defiance collapsed. She wasn't beaten, she wasn't drugged. She simply saw what she would become. The trauma didn't need to be inflicted again, it just needed to be activated. That's how it works now, not through whips and chains, but through emotional inheritance. A sharp word that echoes your grandfather's temper, a fear of failure rooted in your father's bankruptcy, a mistrust of intimacy traced back to your mother's unhealed betrayal. It's not your fault, but it's still your responsibility. Because if you don't rewrite the code, you'll pass it on. You'll become the very architect you're trying to escape. This is why healing is not self-care. It's rebellion. It's looking the ghosts in the eye and saying, "You end with me." The Ashfords feared this moment, a subject who became conscious of the inherited chain. Because that's when the spell breaks. That's when the operating system stutters. That's when the loop fails. So ask yourself, which parts of your pain were planted before you were born? Which behaviors aren't yours, but repetitions? And more importantly, what will you leave unwritten? They say love conquers all. But what if love, your deepest connection, was the very thing they used to keep you bound? This is the hardest truth to accept, because it means questioning the one feeling that feels most real. But that's why they chose it, because no man questions love. Not when it feels like salvation, not when it tastes like safety. But the Ashfords understood what most still don't. Love is not beyond corruption. It is the perfect control mechanism, because it asks you to surrender, willingly. And when weaponized, it doesn't chain your body, it chains your choices. You won't leave a toxic ideology if your father believes in it. You won't question a poisoned system if your mother defends it. You won't walk away from destruction if someone you love tells you it's beautiful. The Ashfords tested this in 1809. They began assigning emotional companions to the most resistant patients. Women who showed no signs of compliance were paired with others who were already broken, who had accepted the system fully. The bond was organic, unforced. They laughed, they cried, they fell in love, and then they complied. Not for the system, but for each other. One letter recovered from a patient reads, "I know it's wrong, I know they're changing us, but if I break the rules, they'll take her from me. So I'll stay, I'll smile, I'll become what they need. Because losing her would destroy me. Do you see it? They didn't need to crush her spirit. They just needed to redirect her love. And now, you're watching the same formula unfold. Loyalty to family over truth. Devotion to brands that emotionally get you. Romance that rewards self-erasure in the name of connection. You think it's choice. It's not. It's emotional programming. And it's not just in who you love, it's how you love. The need, the sacrifice, the blind faith. But love, true love, should never require you to disappear. So ask yourself, have you been loving others more than you love your own truth? Are you giving your soul to people who were trained to hold you in place? Because if you want freedom, you must unlearn every version of love that asks you to shrink. You were told to find yourself, to discover who you are, to wear it proudly, to scream it to the world. But what if the you they gave you was a costume, not chosen, but assigned, not discovered, but installed? From your first breath, they handed you a set of roles: son, student, believer, consumer, citizen, man, and each came with a script, a set of behaviors, acceptable thoughts, limits on desire. You were told this was identity. But identity, as they define it, is containment. A way to filter your choices before you even make them. The Ashfords learned this early. They abandoned names for patients, replacing them with titles. The rebellious, the corrupted, the hysterical, the untamed. These weren't insults. They were designations, used to determine treatment. Once labeled, the subject began behaving accordingly. Not by force, by suggestion. A girl told she was rebellious stopped trying to reason. A woman told she was corrupted stopped believing she could be clean. The label became the cage. The cage became the truth. Look around now. We're drowning in identity markers. Sexual, political, spiritual, digital. Each one comes with a tribe, a uniform, a language, an enemy. And once you're inside that tribe, you're no longer free. You're predictable. And predictability is the currency of control. They don't care which label you wear, as long as you never take it off. Because the moment you stop identifying and start being, you become something they can't categorize, and therefore can't manipulate. So what if I told you, you are not your trauma, you are not your flag, you are not your label, you are not even your name, you are the awareness beneath it all, you are the observer. the one who can choose, change, walk away, rewrite. And that is terrifying to them, because it means you've stepped outside the algorithm. If this hit you hard, stay with me. You think your online life is separate, that what you say, post, like, it's just content. But what if your digital self and your avatar is now your true leash? Not because it's fake, but because it's been taught to behave, taught to be safe, to be liked, to be seen, but never known. Every post becomes a brick in a digital prison you don't realize you're building. The Ashfords could only dream of a system like this. They had to observe behavior. Now, it's logged, sorted, indexed. Every search, every hesitation before clicking, every comment you almost made, but deleted. It's all you, broken into data points, run through algorithms that know when you're vulnerable, when you're afraid, when you're ripe for influence. They call it engagement, but it's emotional surveillance. And what's worse, you're curating it yourself. You've become your own warden. You silence your real thoughts before the algorithm ever sees them. You filter your rage. You neuter your opinions. You replace truth with tone. Not because it's right, but because you know the system rewards submission. And that reward, it's not money. It's not fame. It's belonging, likes, shares. Yes, king. But make no mistake, you're being trained. Every dopamine hit is a micro shock. Every shadow ban, a punishment. You're not just using the system is using you to train itself. Your behavior becomes the blueprint for the next iteration. You are feeding the machine that will replace you. That's the final twist. The avatar isn't you, it's the replacement for you, a version that never questions, never hungers, never evolves. So if you feel the disconnect, if your online life feels like a hollow echo of who you could be, that's not an accident. That's the cost of becoming legible to power. But you don't have to keep feeding it. You can starve the machine, you can fracture the pattern, you can disappear without being erased. Because in Section 30, we finally confront the endgame, the convergence of all control systems into a single outcome, one that no one's talking about, one that's already begun. Still with me. You've seen the symptoms, the false identities, the weaponized love, the engineered emotions, the digital leash. But what you haven't seen is where it's all going. Because these weren't isolated strategies, they're pieces of a design. One goal, one convergence. The Ashfords called it the silencing. And in their final papers, hidden beneath their crumbling estate and only decoded in 1998, they described it like prophecy. When all voices speak within parameters, when all rebellion becomes performance, when all difference is reduced to simulation, the soul will no longer recognize itself. What they feared, what you should fear, isn't tyranny. It's total simulation. A world where everything is allowed, except true difference. Where you can scream, post, protest, brand, but never deviate. Because even rebellion has been commodified. Even your outrage has a SKU number. They don't need to silence you. They just need to flood you. With noise. With options. With dopamine theater that feels like freedom, but leaves you empty. They'll give you every color, as long as it fits inside their palette, every choice, as long as it loops back to the same system. This is the convergence. The church taught obedience. The state taught fear. The family taught shame. The algorithm teaches consensus, not in truth, but in behavior. Until your silence is indistinguishable from your participation. Until you no longer resist, not because you agree, but because you forget how. That's what the Ashfords saw coming. That's why their experiments became more symbolic in their final years. They weren't trying to fix women. They were testing how deeply a soul could be altered before it forgot it ever had one. Now ask yourself, how many of your thoughts are yours? How many of your desires were installed? And if this ends the way they predicted, not with oppression, but with absolute assimilation. Will you remember how to want freedom? If you've come this far, you're not just curious. You're remembering. You've seen the trap, the loop, the mask, and now you want the key. But here's the truth. There is no single exit. There's no clean break from a system this old, this deep, this invisible. What you need are tools, ancient, primal, buried beneath centuries of conditioning. Three tools that every empire, every cult, every digital priesthood has tried to erase from your reach. Because when a man holds them, he becomes sovereign, and sovereign men cannot be programmed. Tool 1. Unfiltered observation. This isn't just awareness. It's the ability to see without reacting, to look at your anger, your lust, your shame, and not flinch, to stare into the algorithm's trap and smile. Because once you can observe the mechanism without being seduced by it, it loses power. Tool 2. Relentless discernment. They taught you to seek approval, to believe authority, to outsource your sense-making. But discernment is the fire that burns through every lie. It says, I will not believe because it's popular. I will not follow because it's easy. I will know because I have stared at it, broken it, rebuilt it myself. Discernment turns consumption into alchemy. You no longer absorb, you refine. Tool 3. Identity fluidity. They told you to find your identity and defend it. But the third tool is to shatter it. Because when you are no longer bound to a name, a tribe, a mask, you can move like water. You are uncatchable, unpredictable, unprogrammable. This is why the Ashfords feared the awakened, not the rebels, not the loud ones, but the fluid ones, the ones who could slip through any net and carry truth in silence. You don't have to fight the system. You have to become too real for it to simulate. That's the paradox. You win not by resisting the machine, but by becoming something it cannot imitate. A man who chooses his thoughts, owns his meaning, and wears no leash. You're almost there. Not every subject broke. Not every soul bent to the needle, the prayer, the scalpel, the lie. Some saw through it, some remembered, and those few, the failed patients, were quietly erased from the Ashfords records. But not before they left behind messages, scratched into stone, tucked inside stitched seams, carved into the undersides of floorboards and old bed frames. They weren't escape plans. They were warnings, revelations, seeds of resistance. One was found in the back binding of a hymnal, written in coded verse. They can scrape the bone, peel the name, but they cannot steal the fire. The part that watches, the part that waits, the part that never forgot the sky. That's what they couldn't reach. The watcher behind the eyes. Another message, etched into the back of a vanity mirror. What they erase, you must remember. What they name, you must rename. What they silence, you must sing. These women didn't just resist. They awakened. And in awakening, they became dangerous. Because they could smile on command, obey without obedience, say all the right words, while hiding truth like fire under skin. The sisters never knew who they were watching anymore, because these broken women had learned to wear masks of compliance, while building inner kingdoms that could not be touched. That's what you must understand. Freedom doesn't begin when the system falls. It begins inside you, when you reclaim your voice, silently, defiantly, without asking permission. When every movement you make becomes intentional. When your eyes stop seeking safety and start seeking clarity. Because once you're clear, you're unusable, and the system doesn't know what to do with the unusable. They vanish you, ignore you, or call you mad. But inside, you're whole. So here's your final test. Can you hold the mask in one hand and the truth in the other without forgetting which one is real? If you can, then you're ready for the final revelation. The inheritance no one was supposed to claim, the ritual the Ashfords failed to complete, and the power they buried, but never destroyed. This is the end, but not the kind you're used to. No twist, no credits, no catharsis, because what waits here is not resolution, it's responsibility. The Ashfords were never just villains, they were architects. They didn't act from hatred, they acted from vision, a dark, ancient vision. If the soul can be fragmented, if memory can be reprogrammed, if identity can be rewritten, then man is no longer man. He is a page, a script, a system, waiting to be overwritten. And they almost succeeded. They built a model of compliance so elegant, so efficient, that it outlived them. You're standing inside it now. But they forgot one thing, the unfinished ritual. The final act required something they didn't possess. Not a body, not a mind, but a witness. Someone to look at it all and refuse. Not with violence, but with awareness. You are that witness. That's what this story has always been. A ritual, a test, a mirror. Every section wasn't just a descent into the Ashfords' history. It was a descent into your own, into the fragments, the programs, the silence. And now that you've seen it all, you can't go back. You've crossed the threshold. You are no longer programmable in the same way, and that scares them, because one awakened man becomes a signal, a virus in the system, a sovereign node, a glitch they cannot predict. So if you feel that shift, if something inside you has cracked open, leave this in the comments. The soul remembers. Type it twice. The soul remembers. The soul remembers. Not for the algorithm, but for you. Because now you know. Now you carry the fire. Not as a torch, but as a weapon. And the next time the system asks you to obey, conform, forget, you'll remember this moment, this descent, this dangerous knowledge. And you'll smile, because they almost had you. But now, you are no longer theirs. You are your own. And that was the part of the ritual they could never complete.